Hi, this is Miss Hani from Olympian High School. I did a video part 1 about Islamic cultural values in the post-classical period, and this is a follow-up to that video because I got cut off from talking about Ibn Rashid or Averroes. So this is, instead of with a PowerPoint, I'll be focusing on some of the information in your book that refers to the same information, page 365 to the end of this chapter in chapter 14, which is, again, by Dr. Bentley, Traditions and Encounters. So this section is on Islamic values and cultural exchanges. So one of the things you need to know, as I mentioned in the last video, is that it wasn't just that the Muslims were pushing out their culture, they were also absorbing the culture of some of the peoples whose lands they conquered. So the first part of this section talks about the formation of Islamic cultural tradition, and it emphasizes how Islamic thinkers help promote Islamic teachings and a sense of cultural unity by teaching Islamic values through things like, Islamic law, Sharia, which got applied all throughout the Dar al-Islam and was enforced by the Qadis, and it is described by the ulama, which are the educated people, and it talks about madrasas, which are Islamic schools, which helped to teach Islamic ideas and promoted a more advanced education in Islamic theology, and how paper, a technology, also facilitated the scholars' ability to teach their students about Islamic teachings. Then it goes into the Sufis, and it talks about how the Sufis were super popular, and they were popular because they were very kind, devoted, and they, had an unusual way, as I mentioned, of thinking about Islam versus, say, the Orthodox Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, or the Shia Muslims. Sometimes they allowed people to continue to believe in some of their pre-Islamic ideas, and again, they popularized a more spiritual approach to God, passionate singing, spirited dancing. But that's part of what made them really popular and what helped popularize Islam throughout the Islamic world. One of the most famous Sufis I mentioned was Al-Ghazali. It talks about him here and how he rejected the more rational, philosophical approach to God. Really remember that Sufi missionaries are part of what helped win a lot of converts throughout the Dar al-Islam. Again, they were very kind, tolerant, charismatic, and they were more lax in how they allowed converts to practice, emphasizing more of a heart-based approach, devotional approach. The Hajj was also, which means the pilgrimage, which you're supposed to do as a Muslim, also was a symbol of unity for the Muslim world because all Muslims were supposed to engage in the Hajj at some point in their lives if they could afford it and if they were well enough. So this, along with the ulama, the Qadis, the Sufi missionaries, all of that is going to help reinforce this idea that you're culturally united, even if you aren't the same, say, ethnic group. Even if you're in Persia, or you're Arabic, or you're Greek, or you're, the Dar al-Islam was large, when all stretched all the way to Spain. And so these were things that made people feel united despite their distance and despite some of their differences. And then the next section mentions how it wasn't just Islamic values that were spreading, but the Muslims were also adopting cultural traditions of the peoples whose lands they conquered. It talks about, for example, how from Persia they adopted ideas of kingship that preceded them, that were part of the Sassanid dynasties. It talks about they adopted the Persian views of kings as wise but benevolent rulers. Also, a lot of Persian literature and literary ideas. For example, the Rubaiyat, the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, which were these stories, these popular stories of romance set in the Abbasid dynasty. From India, they very much loved mathematics and learned about numbers. For example, what we think of as Arabic numerals were actually Hindi numerals that the Arabs learned from the Indians, and then who spread knowledge of that throughout Europe. So it'll tell you about that. And then from learning about Indian math, they were able to develop other mathematical disciplines like algebra, which is an Arabic word, right? Al-Jabr. And they loved also knowledge about Indian medicine. And so they loved some things about Indian knowledge, so Indian medicine, Indian math, but they really rejected Indian religious beliefs, obviously, because they're Muslim, they're monotheistic, and they have a very passionate view towards their own faith, and that's what this is saying here. The Muslims also admired some of the philosophers of Greece, and they became especially enamored with Plato, and then later with Aristotle. They tried to harmonize the ideas and teachings of Plato with Islam. You know that the conservative Sufi al-Ghazali rejected this. He said that the human brain is too frail to understand God that way. You should have a more devotional approach. And so Muslims then turned away from Plato and towards Aristotle. And you have philosophers like Ibn Rashid, known in the West as Averroes, popularizing the works of Aristotle, and eventually this will be learned by the Christians. The Christians will learn about Aristotle through the Muslims and come up with their own way of combining Christian teachings with Greek philosophy, and that's going to give rise to scholasticism, a movement called scholasticism. And so as you can see, there's a lot of information in this section about how the Muslims borrowed from certain cultural traditions and also influenced some of the areas that they went